All right. Welcome everyone to Slow Walk number, I think 4, maybe 5. Deanna?
Four. Four.
4. Okay. So Slow Walk is our time once a month for Deanna and myself. I'm Michael Hebb, to spend some extended time with somebody that we're fascinated by, somebody whose work moves us. And so again, my name is Michael Hebb, the founder of Death Over Dinner and EOL, and I'm here with my friend Deanna. Deanna, do you want to say hi?
Hey everyone. You probably know me, and I'm a founder of Care Doula School of Accompanying the Dying, and just trying to bring palliative care to people from day one of diagnosis. You don't have to be dying to get it. That's my message.
And for those of you joining us throughout, you can ask questions in the Q&A. I'd also invite you to answer questions that we're asking our guest. We'd love to have you go ahead and take it as an opportunity to share in chat, and maybe start with who you are, where you're coming in from, and why you're excited about the topic today. We get to spend the next hour and a half with Logan Ury. And Logan has a book that is being talked about everywhere, it seems. And it's a book called How to Not Die Alone. And there's some obvious connection to Deanna and my work, and then some not so obvious connections as you dive in a little bit deeper into Logan's work. But Logan is the director of relationship science at Hinge, which is a dating app. Most of you probably know about Hinge. And so, Logan, thanks for being with us.
Thank you. I've been really looking forward to this. I don't know exactly what to expect, but I think it's going to be really fun.
Yeah, we'll take very good care of you.
Yeah.
And just to start, Logan, some people are going to be familiar with your work and your book, but let's just share with those as if they don't know about your work and what it means to be a relationship scientist and what your book's about and the work that you do.
Yes. So thanks for having me. My work really combines my two areas of interest. And so the first one is psychology and behavioral science, the study of decision making. And the other one is love, dating, and relationships. And so for the last 10 years, I've tried to find different ways to combine the two. And so professionally, I started off at Google working in a behavioral science team. If anyone's familiar with Dan Ariely, who's one of the great thinkers in decision making, and we were applying behavioral science to Google and Google products and Google marketing. And I liked that, but I was like, what I really care about is dating and relationships. And how can I actually take what I know about how people are irrational, how people's brains work, and how can I apply that to help people make better decisions in dating and relationships? And so that's what I've been doing. And I did it in a small scale through one-on-one dating coaching and matchmaking. And then now I've written this book, and it's all about thinking about relationships as a series of decisions. And so if you're single and you don't want to be, what are the bad patterns holding you back? What are the blind spots that are preventing you from finding love, but you can't identify on your own? And so the book is this A to Z guide that takes you from the beginning. Why am I single? What are my blind spots? All the way through attachment theory, what matters more and less than you think in modern relationships, how to use dating apps, how to meet people in real life, remember that. And then all the way through, should we define the relationship? Should we move in together? Should we break up? Should we get married? And so it's really this step-by-step guide. And then my work at Hinge is also helping people in a large scale, because one of the principles of behavioral science is that our decision-making is impacted by the environment. And so the environment in which most people are dating is the dating app. And so actually changing the dating app itself, I have found, is one of the most powerful ways to actually impact modern dating.
Interesting.
Our behavior is modified by our environment. We need to talk about that as that relates to, and the decisions we make are related.
Absolutely.
But Deanna, did you have some?
Well, I feel like I'm short-circuiting. I'm always short-circuiting by brilliant people. So the two things that is happening, I'm thinking of Dr. Gabor Mate, and I'm thinking about artificial intelligence and having, the the app be like what you're talking about. The environment is actually being the app. And then I'm thinking of Gabor Mate. You know what? Do you know what? You know him? Do you know his work?
I do not.
Oh gosh. Okay, so we'll talk about him another time. But yes, he's taught all about psychology. What you're talking about, the environment, social, everything. I just would love to hear more about the app part of what you're saying.
Sure. Well, in a general sense, one of my favorite experiments on this was actually done at Google. I wasn't involved in this research, but these people at Google, you know, they notoriously have these micro kitchens where they provide free snacks, and they wanted people to eat healthier. And so they'd always had fruits and dried nuts and things around, but they also had these peanut M&Ms in these very alluring glass containers. And so they measured how many peanut M&Ms people were eating normally. And then they decided to move the peanut M&Ms from these glass containers to these opaque containers. And you had to pick up the lid and you had to look for them and then you had to have them. And what they found was after a few months of doing this, the Google employees in that New York office ate several million fewer M&Ms than they had before. And so the point of this is that if you just look at traditional economics, it would say people have preferences. They either want to eat M&Ms or they want to eat dried fruit, and it doesn't matter what's going on. But what this experiment shows is that when you created friction, when you made it harder to find the M&Ms, when you didn't have these alluring M&Ms right in your face, people made different decisions. And so the way that our choices are presented affects the choice that we make. And so in the dating app, what happens is that the dating apps are limited to the information they can show. They can show things like height, how close the person is to you, age, and maybe things like how good they are at choosing flattering photos. And then merely because those are the things represented in the dating app, they become more important. And that's because of this principle, what gets measured is what matters. And so when people are making decisions in a dating profile, they are emphasizing height more than they would if they met that person at a wedding or a party or a bar. And so because of the way information is presented in the dating app, it makes certain things like height and age matter more than they would elsewhere. And that makes people make different decisions.
Got it. And especially given the current moment where we aren't meeting people in bars, unless we're in a very, a few within the United States. Dating apps certainly have a completely different relationship, they're really our only access point right now, I would imagine. But I'm curious to hear how you think, what has it been like the last year for people that are dating, but just kind of people trying to find love in general. Just curious about some of your big reflections. With COVID.
So I started Hinge a year ago last week. So really right at the time that the pandemic was hitting the US, and I was in New York, that's where Hinge is based. And so it really feels like my entire time there working on this research has really been in the shadow of the pandemic. And so I can speak to what we've seen. And so in the beginning, we were wondering, are people going to take, a month off from dating? We didn't know how long the pandemic would be. Are people going to take a year off from dating? But it's definitely not what we saw. We were really impressed by people's creativity, by people's resilience. Basically, no one had done video dates before. Video dating was something you might do with a partner when you're traveling, but it wasn't really how people were getting to know each other. If you would have said in 2019, let's hop on a FaceTime, somebody would have found that very weird. And pretty quickly, people switched to video dating. And one of the most interesting things that I've found that I think will be relevant for this conversation is that people change their priorities around what mattered. And so I know in my work as a dating coach that a lot of people were going through life saying, I'll focus on work and I'll find love later. I'll focus on my friends because I'd rather spend a night with the people that I already know and know that I enjoy spending time with. And I'll focus on finding somebody in the future. And so when the pandemic hit and people were spending a lot of time alone and people wished that they had somebody to be with, we saw a lot of self-reflection and people changing their priorities around what mattered to them. And so what I've seen is people who weren't focused on a serious relationship are now saying, I'm ready to find someone and I want to make that a priority. And so I think spending time alone, having the world become much more quiet, not being distracted by business trips and weddings and social activities and all the other things that we do to keep ourselves busy and social and maybe not focus on the big things, I think that really affected how people prioritize their time. And so even in my work, I've seen way more people coming directly to me saying, after doing XYZ, now I'm really ready to focus and find someone.
I mean, that makes perfect sense, Deanna, and I, in the work.
Yeah, where my heart's going right now, knowing some of your story, where my heart's going right now is how in the world I can imagine in so many ways how Hinge may have supported you as you've been walking your own journey. And in another way, I'm thinking, if you don't mind talking a little bit about that. And at the same time, everything seems so insignificant when you're walking through something big. So how did you keep Hinge as important? Like, was it difficult that Hinge stayed very important, even as you were walking through your journey?
Yeah. So for people listening, basically, so I started Hinge last year and the pandemic started. And also my then fiance, now husband, was unfortunately diagnosed with a rare form of bone cancer. And so over the last year, we've also been navigating the medical system, navigating, 9+ months of intensive chemotherapy, a below the knee amputation, multiple surgeries. It's been a really intense time. And so, I mean, I think there's a few ways that I could respond to your question, but one of them is that I really like working. I like the work that I do. I feel like I have an impact. It helps me kind of feel powerful and in control and have the ability to kind of own my time and have the impact that I want. And so I definitely think that there were moments in which I was channeling sort of some of my anxiety into work. And it's not just Hinge, it's really launching a book. For anyone who's had a book come out, and I know Michael has, and Deanna, have you written a book? Yeah, it's, I finished my manuscript in November 2019, but it's really one more year of editing, marketing, choosing a title, choosing a cover. And so I really had 2 full-time jobs last year. And I think that just having a realm in which I felt powerful and in control was a really helpful thing, because when it comes to medical decisions and just navigating these gigantic institutions, you often feel out of control. And so whether it was a good thing or a bad thing psychologically, I think it was just a coping mechanism of staying sane.
That makes sense. Do you mind walking us back a little bit to how you and your husband met? And you're the dating expert. So, and I'd heard you say in other interviews, you got it wrong personally. So I'm curious about the quote unquote meet cute that is you and your.
Oh, sure. Yes. Not everyone needs a meet cute, but I think our meeting was pretty cute. Yeah. So we met in college when we were 19. And we know this because we became Facebook friends afterwards. Otherwise, I don't think we would remember. And then about 7 years later, I saw him on Tinder and I swiped left on him because I just made a snap judgment and decided he wasn't the right person for me. And then later that summer, I hosted this lunch for Harvard alumni who worked at Google, and he came. And at the lunch, I mentioned, I'm trying to learn the statistics programming language. And he said, I just dropped out of a math PhD. I can teach it to you. And so he started tutoring me in this coding language. But at the time, he said to me, I don't like international travel. I don't like people who go to Burning Man. And so I wrote him off. I was like, closed-minded, not the person for me. And meanwhile, I was chasing after this guy I had met at Burning Man. And so when Michael talks about all the poor dating choices I was making, this was definitely one of them, and representative of a pattern where I was trapped in this loop of pursuing people who weren't interested in me and sort of getting addicted to the chase, getting addicted to the, will he or won't he, and really confusing that anxiety for chemistry. And so I spent a long time chasing after this Burning Man guy until eventually, I have this memory of just crying on my friend Corey's couch, and it just sucked. I was really putting myself into a situation that didn't feel good for me. And finally, I, through this Reiki master that I was seeing, I wound up seeing this dating coach, and it was really helpful. It was a lot of work that helped me understand, well, how did I want my partner to make me feel? Desired, appreciated, smart, secure. Okay, well, how is this Burning Man guy making me feel? Insecure, anxious, unlovable, pathetic, all of these things. Well, did I know anyone who made me feel the way that I hoped to feel? Yes, this guy at work, this guy who is teaching me R. And so I was really able to see him in a new light and say, who cares if he doesn't like going to Burning Man? I could do that with somebody else. International travel, I'll show him why that's great. And so I really started spending more time with him at work. And eventually the friendship turned into a romantic relationship. And then, here we are 6 years together in a really happy relationship. And so it was all about breaking that bad habit, what's known in relationship science as the anxious avoidant loop of pursuing someone who's not interested in you, them pulling away, and you sort of reinforce each other's habits. And instead going after someone like my husband, who I should mention has been to Burning Man with me twice. We've traveled all over the world. And why I say that is that so often we write people off for these silly reasons that we think are representative of their core values. But actually, we were young and he just hadn't been exposed to certain things. And so what was much more important was our dynamic and how he made me feel, not some of these surface level hot takes that he said that actually ended up being, pretty flexible in the scheme of things.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Deanna, do you have a question? I've got plenty of places I'd love to go.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you were describing the whole avoidant, panic thing, and that's chemistry for love, it's funny, but it's not funny. It's truly, it's traumatizing.
Yeah.
And so the work that you're doing, I'm sure you have it all spelled out in your book, which I'm going to dive into soon. But so tell me about that. Not everybody is the avoidant is the one chasing the avoidant one, right? The avoidant one has their own issues. But talk to the one who chases the avoidant one. I'm always the one chasing the avoidant one. So talk to those of us in that category.
Yeah, it's very
and
common.
you talked about that you have ways, your irrationality, like finding your irrationality. That was awesome. I love the way you frame that.
Thank you. Yeah, so, in this field of relationship science, which is the study of how love works, which I should say, some people say, you're trying to turn us into these robots and you're trying to help us make precise decisions and you input your likes and you find your soulmate. And that's not at all what's going on. What I'm really trying to do is say love is very natural, but dating and choosing your partner, that's not a natural thing. That's a skill. And that's something that we can learn about and get better at and learn from other people. And so sort of the frame for all of my work is the idea that love is natural, but dating is a skill. And what I try to do in my coaching and in my book is really help people invest in that skill. And so in this field of relationship science, one of the best researched aspects is this thing called attachment theory. And it started in developmental psychology with this guy, John Bowlby. And what he would do, and it later went on to have several researchers that did similar studies, is they would see what's your attachment to your primary caregiver. And so this was really looking at children. And so in the original research study, they would have mothers bring their babies into the lab. And then the mothers would have the babies play in the corner, and then the mother would leave the lab. And the research assistant would see what happened to the baby. And so in one situation, the baby would start crying, the mom would walk back in, the mom would pick up the baby, and the baby would keep crying. The second situation, the mom would leave, the baby would cry, the mom would pick up the baby, and the baby would be soothed and stop crying. And in the third situation, the mom would leave, the baby would not cry, and when the mom walked back in, the baby would ignore the mom and pretend not to care, but they knew from sort of the biometrics of the baby that the baby was very agitated and upset. And so these three types are known as anxious, secure, and avoidant. So the anxious baby is the one that was crying when the mom left, and even when the mom walked back in, was not soothed. People who are anxious attachment, they always feel like somebody's going to leave them. They want to be close, and they're always reaching out. And so what this looks like in dating and relationships is, Deanna, if we were dating and you flew somewhere, I'd be like, text me as soon as you land. Why haven't I heard from you? I constantly want to be in touch, and I'm afraid of you abandoning me. The second type is the securely attached one. And so upset when the mom leaves, but reassured by the mom when the mom returns. And so comfortable with intimacy, but also comfortable with independence. And the third type is avoidant attached. And the avoidant attached people, they feel like they're going to be abandoned. And so they want to push you away first. And so these are the people who say, I need my space. I have to focus on myself. I have to focus on work. They're always pushing back. And so people in that middle group who are securely attached, they're very good in relationships because they can be close to you, but they're not on top of you. And around 50% of the population is securely attached. Unfortunately, for people on the dating apps, those are not the pool of people on dating apps because they get into relationships and they stay in them. And so what often happens in the single pool is you have those anxious attached daters dating those avoidant attached daters. And so this is what happens. I think that dating is pursuing somebody who's going to leave me. I think that dating somebody is feeling smothered by the other person. And so they are reinforcing each other's bad habits around dating. And people get stuck in this anxious attachment loop for years. And it's not until they break the habit, which for me came through working with the dating coach, that they say, whoa, that didn't feel good. That not knowing if she's going to call, that was anxiety, not chemistry. And so when they start dating someone secure who does what they say they will, who's comfortable having emotional conversations, who is reliable, who's good at communicating, in the beginning, it can feel really different. And sometimes people say, this is so boring, it's so predictable. But no, that boringness is a sign of security. And so really in my work, one of the biggest changes people can make is identifying that toxic, anxious, avoidant loop for what it is and actually pursuing that secure person.
And can somebody, I know that knowing where you are on the spectrum is significant. Self-knowledge in any field of endeavor is important. As a behavioral scientist, have you found that people, and I'm actually going somewhere a little bit different with this as a follow-up, but you found that people are able to move from anxious or attached? And I know that there's that devil's triangle of like people that are anxious and attached, or anxious and avoidant.
Yeah.
We've all known a few of those maybe, but can people move towards more secure?
Yeah.
And how can they do that?
So the research shows that around 25% of people can actually shift their attachment styles. But it is really challenging, especially when some of it is biological, some of it is based on your relationship with your primary caregiver as a child. And so what I really focus on in my work is just know what are the steps you can take. You can know what you are, and then you can know what your triggers are, and you can try to avoid that red zone. And so I can speak about the anxiously attached people. And so for me, I know when I'm getting to a place where I feel really upset and I'm flooding and I'm full of emotions and I'm in that fight or flight mode, and I take out my phone and I start anxiously pecking away at the keyboard and, sending 25 messages in a row. And this is called protest behavior, right? You are sort of triggered, you're in your red zone, and you're doing all these things, and you're punishing the person, and you're trying to reconnect and this and that. And so what can I do to prevent myself from getting into the red zone? Maybe it's things like saying to the person, I'm sure you're going to be really busy when you're on your business trip, but can you just text me, once a day, or can you call me in the morning? I'd love to speak to you, and sort of preventing that from happening. Having clear expectation setting. When getting upset about being away from somebody, can you call a friend and complain instead of coming on too strong with your partner? And so, I think this is true for many aspects of life, but just knowing yourself, knowing your triggers, and then having healthier behaviors that you choose instead for both the anxious and avoidantly attached people. That's really the best way of kind of owning your attachment style and doing the best with it that you can. And then the other thing, which isn't necessarily available to everyone, is finding a secure partner. Because if the root of a lot of these issues is that anxious avoidant loop, then dating someone who's secure and learning from their patterns is one of the best ways to do this. And so my husband, his mom is a therapist. He's, I would say, a very reasonable person with great communication styles. And I tell a story in the book about when we first started dating and he did something to bother me. I can't even remember what it was. And I went into my normal mode of angrily typing away all these horrible comments. And I just knew that we would get into a fight and that's how the night would end. And instead he wrote back and said, sounds like this is something we should discuss in person, which was just totally unexpected because he's not gaslighting me. He's not saying this doesn't matter. He's saying, I can hear that this is important to you and this conversation would be better had face to face. And just, it was like this jolt to the system where I had a pattern, he was changing it, and then I got to make a new choice. And so that's really what behavior change looks like, is you think things are going to go a certain way, something different happens, and then you make different choices. And actually, that's one of the interesting silver linings of the pandemic, is that people who are in these very deep grooves of behavior, the pandemic itself was a jolt to the system, and we have seen people making different choices in many aspects of their lives.
Well, and I think, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, Deanna. I had this pet theory that actually grew out of a conversation with a mutual friend that we have, Dr. Jordana Jacobs, around this notion of the attachment, these classic attachment models we know and we relate to around romantic relationships. But how do they relate? Are they emblematic of our relationship to our death? Because Deanna and I know this very clearly, and I'd like your thoughts, Deanna. Like, there are people who have an anxious relationship. There are people that have an avoidant. There are people who have an anxious and avoidant, and there are people that have a stable relationship to it. It isn't determined there's some X factor, I think, around, and this is one's relationship to their own mortality, and to, the mortality of those around them. And it's not as directly linked to our primary caregivers. It's almost like, what is your relationship to the universe? And your sense of attachment. So, just, this is about thoughts. Deanna, do you have any reflections on that?
You know what, when she's talking and when you're talking, really when anybody's talking, I'm always taking it to the realm of going, because when you work with people who are dying and their families, nothing is BS. There's no superficiality in anything. It's very, a lot of that has just been removed. And when you were talking, I was the whole time thinking, how can we apply this to end of life relationships? How can we apply this to people going through serious illness together, not knowing if this is their last week together, because always something can happen. And as you were talking, I'm thinking too, Michael, like you were saying, I think of death as another person in a relationship, or serious illness as another person, another entity in the relationship. And each person has a relationship with that. So not only are they having a relationship together, they're having a relationship with this illness or the dying. And now it's the three of them. And now there's so much that when you talk about the attachment, avoidant, and all that stuff, like what you were saying, Michael, we each have that with death, that's our relationship. And then we have it with our loved one. And I think what you're saying, there can be things, Logan, that you're doing. I was saying, I just would love for you all to work on that. I would love Hinge or your parent company or whatever that would be a fascinating avoidant, like you were saying, Michael, if you're avoidant, if you're not, and you're doing with your death or their death, and that could be so healing.
Logan, any thoughts on extending it?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't, the more common question I get is, how do I apply my research to business situations, right?
Oh,
a lot of people are like, I want to bring you to my company, but you have to talk about business, which is funny because, anyway, I have not considered it in this, but one thing that came to mind is, when my husband was diagnosed, it definitely had an impact on our friend group. And it was interesting to see how different people responded. And this is a generalization, but in my extended group of friends, there tends to be this trend of very extroverted, bubbly women dating these more scientific, introverted, engineering type guys. And so that's my husband and me and a bunch of other couples that we're close to. And one thing that emerged as some of the female friends were talking about how their partners were responding was that, our husbands or boyfriends were taking it really hard. And we were trying to understand what was going on for them. And I think for that type of guy, they're very rational. And so when they hear the prognosis, which is, my husband's, he has osteosarcoma, which has a 30% 5-year survival rate. And so when they hear 30% 5-year survival rate, they really think about, okay, there's a 2 out of 3 chance that he won't be here in 5 years. Whereas my brain just doesn't go there. I stay in this very optimistic place of, well, he looks pretty healthy and he's vegan. And before the cancer, he was the healthiest person I know. And I just tell you, I don't really think about him dying. That's not really a real possibility in my mind. And that's what my friends were saying. Whereas they were saying their partners in their sort of hyper rational brains, it was much easier for them to go to the place of death, and that mortality and death and accidents, their sort of more neurotic personalities live in that space all the time. And so they were contemplating his death a lot more than I was, because just the way that their brain chemistry works, they thought a lot more about the reality of it versus, how my friends and I were thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of psychology that impacts how people deal with terminal diagnosis within a friend group, within their personally. The thing is, it's not one size fits all, even just for a person. Like the news that you receive personally versus the news you receive about a friend can elicit a completely different response, and a different response later in life. And it's fascinating. It's like we have this incredible framework built around relationships, and we're so invested in it. And so it's curious to me, like, if we did look at it from end of life relationship and looked at that structure. I doubt Hinge is going to get super excited about it. But
No. When you were talking, Logan, what I was thinking is, because I was reading the chat over here, and they were saying something about, well, would Hinge do this, that, and the other that would help heal dating stuff? So what I was thinking, that made me think, oh, what about when you were talking about your girlfriends were talking this way and their husbands talking that way? I just thought it would be wonderful, certain types of people, when they handle it like this and when they handle it like that, ways to cope with that, or ways to support when someone copes like that. So like, say you're a person whose husband is facing something very serious. People are constantly asking me, how do I support them? How do I support them? What do I do? What do I say? What and all of that. So you just describing yourself and how you think about your husband's illness is going to give so many people that hear this tonight a total reality check on how to handle you. If they have a friend like you, they're going to stay in the happy zone with you unless you say something different. And that's what they probably should do. They shouldn't talk to you as if they were talking to one of your husband's friends.
Yeah, I often in my head think about, I haven't written this down, but, I think in my head, like, what I've learned about how to support somebody going through what I'm going through.
From your personality, right? Your style.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. With the frame of this is what's been useful for me. But, there's just, if anyone is listening and it does have a friend going through this, I think there are a couple of things I could say. One of them is, a lot of times people are seeking information, but it's actually kind of a burden to always ask for medical updates. And it's like, it's their way of caring. They're very invested and they're like, what's going on? But like, you just don't want to be a medical, you don't want to be transmitting medical information all the time. I think that that's kind of a cognitive burden. And then another thing is just understanding people's practical needs. And so it's like, we're in Houston paying for an Airbnb. We also pay rent in Oakland, money towards like Whole Foods or Airbnb or stuff like that would be very useful. Whereas like people want to send us like vegan ice cream. I'm like, he doesn't even like ice cream. Like, we don't want vegan ice cream, like all these things. And like, probably the most helpful thing that anyone ever did was I had a bunch of ants in my apartment and I was just so overwhelmed. And somebody just came over and like dealt with the ants. And it's like, just really anticipating like what in their day-to-day life is challenging. And that's going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. And I think it's really hard to anticipate like what are the small things to take out of people's ways, but removing those obstacles is like what gets you to the hospital to do the visit, or like what makes your mind clear for the call with the doctor. And so really just understanding like what are the small needs that allow them to focus on the big needs.
Well said, Logan. Thank you for that.
I wonder how long it's going to be, Deanna, before our world, the end of life world, gets behavioral scientists to deeply invest. I mean, romantic love is much newer than death.
I don't know. I think they're both pretty old.
Well, that's why it's so fascinating, I think. You know, romantic love is new. It's not the way it's always been.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, that is true. And the idea of marrying for love is very new. But I mean, I can even tell you I sit between these two worlds, and I'm not the most famous behavioral scientist. Like, no one's ever heard of me before a month ago, but like, why did I write the first book about dating and relationships with behavioral science? And it's because I think people didn't take it seriously or didn't feel like it could be studied. And, a lot of behavioral science focuses on things like saving money, eating healthier, working out more. But the quality of our relationships is so important, and it defines our health, happiness, overall life satisfaction. And so I do think that it deserves serious scientific study. And in my case, that means applying what I know from behavioral science.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And I hope somebody does that for your world as well.
Yeah, we're accepting resumes.
I have a friend. Yeah, I'm serious. I would love to kind of throw it out there to some of my friends. And I know this isn't exactly what you do, but I have a friend whose big project this year is rethinking inheritance, and just the idea that why is so much wealth passed down, and what would it mean to help boomers rethink that. And so I feel like couching that in a larger conversation around how are people thinking about death, and how are people thinking about death and money, that could be a good segue to get behavioral scientists interested. They love to talk about money.
Absolutely. I mean, we're in
and the whole studying the inheritance thing, that's the segue in itself. Like I love that. That's what I feel like, Michael, that's what you're doing by bringing people like Logan and wanting to bring all these different kinds of people, is really expanding our consciousness around what can help us in these times, in end of life times and serious illness times. Yeah.
We need light to be shined in from these different fields, and that's always how breakthrough happens. It's not when you just go directly to the
like looking right at it. Yeah,
and the nose of it. And that's why it's important for us to talk to somebody who's a behavioral science and is focused on go ahead, Logan.
I was just going to say, one person in the field, have you heard of the name Hal Hershfield?
No. Mm-mm.
He's interesting. He's a professor at UCLA, and I can share some of his research and then sort of how I've applied it maybe in a way that's interesting, because he might be somebody cool to talk to. So basically the idea is, why don't people save more for retirement? And one of the ideas is that when we think about our future self, they don't feel like us. They feel like this different person. And so he did this research where he showed people aged photos of themselves. Oh, somebody in the chat is saying, what's his name? Hal Hershfield. And we can send out a link later. And so he would show people an aged image of themselves. And so people who were making retirement decisions when looking at this aged photo of themselves invested more in their retirement funds than people who didn't. And so the idea is that he really connected the dots that your future self is an extension of you. It's not a different person, by making it real and helping us overcome what's known as the present bias, which is just a fancy way of saying we overemphasize the present moment. And so about 5 years ago, I was in this really crazy freak accident where this huge eucalyptus tree fell on me in Golden Gate Park. And it was just one of those stories you hear about where it's like 1 inch in either direction and you wouldn't be here. And like, somebody happened to observe it and it was very scary. And afterwards I was like, well, I really want to do something to mark this occasion. And so I started having these annual obituary parties. And so what I did at these obituary parties was I took the research from Hal Hirschfield and I would invite about 10 friends and I would take a photo of them and I would use some free photo app to create an aged photo of them. And so I would sit them down and I would have them just stare at this photo of them where they looked like they were in their 60s or 70s. And then I would have them write their future obituary. And so the thing about, why am I forgetting the word? What's it called when the speech that you gave at someone's funeral?
A eulogy.
A eulogy. The thing about a eulogy is you want to make the person sound great and you're always talking, even if the person's an asshole, you're always saying the nicest things. But I think the eulogy is really defining somebody's meaning and what was their life all about and what did they accomplish and was it being a matriarch, was it being a CEO, whatever it was. And so I would really have people focus on how they wanted to be remembered. And I had a bunch of prompts. And for me, that was one of the reasons why I quit my job in tech and pursued this dating and relationship stuff full time. Because when I would write my obituary every year, it would come up. And other friends of mine have quit their jobs or gotten married or broken up or adopted children based on this exercise. And so I think I'm so interested in the work that you do, but I think from the behavioral science perspective, one of the hardest things to overcome is that we feel such separation between our present selves and our future selves. And if you can use some of these tricks like aging photos, you can actually help people connect the dots between the different ages of their lives.
This is so good. When you were talking about studies on like this, all the studies that are going on in every direction, people do study like meaning and what brings meaning to people, and they do all of that. And in hospice and end of life circles, we know that people do what we call life review, where they just naturally go into their stories of their life. And it's just something we've come to expect. We don't need a legacy project for somebody to do that. So I think this whole legacy project, what brings meaning to people's lives, Dr. Barry Baines, I think, was the first one who brought in the whole idea of like a legacy project type of thing, but it came from this life review. And you'll find people will tell stories about that. And I love the way the studies are showing what people are saying at the end of their lives, what matters most. And I love and then a lot of the when you're well, talking about the end of life is a whole different thing than when you're ill talking about the end of life, or when you're dying talking about the end of life. So when you're well, talking about the end of life and what can bring meaning, it can be very deep and fun and exploratory and all of this stuff. And so a lot of things are moving into that direction, and I think your work is going to be powerful there.
Thank you. I hope so.
Well, and there's some interesting similarities between best practices that we learned from Looking for Love, and like that your book so details, and then some of the things that we've noticed are the result of the medicine. I like to say death is the medicine, because when we do this work of coming to a confrontation or a relationship with our mortality, there's a lot of nutrient that we get. There's a lot of wisdom that we get, and there always has been. And obviously, Looking for Love is one of the great ways of knowing them ourselves and knowing the universe and the depth of feeling. And same thing with mortality. And there's some of the elements that are similar that come up for me. And in end of life, we do get to understand what matters most to us and what is a priority. And like in pandemic, people are really having an encounter with their mortality.
Yeah.
So curious to hear a bit more of that. When we hear like when there's a crisis, more people get married. more people, that there's after a major threat, I think. So just some thoughts on
Yeah.
on that relationship.
Yeah. What was going through my mind when you said that was, I mean, I'm sure this is like 101 of the work that you all do, but the idea of deathbed regrets and people saying, I wish I had spent more time with my family and less time in the boardroom. And I wish I had focused on relationships and less on my bank account and all of that. And so this idea of, I wish I had focused on what really matters in making decisions about how to spend your time. And the corollary in my work is a chapter I have called Go for the Life Partner, Not the Prom Date. And the idea is that when you're 17 and you're choosing your prom date, okay, who are you looking for? Somebody who's going to look good in photos, somebody who will dance the night away, maybe somebody you want to have sex with at the end of the night. But that's not really the person that you should choose for your long-term partner. And things that matter at 17 are really different than the things that matter when it's time to choose a person to settle down with and create a life with. And that whole chapter is about stuff that matters less than people think it does for long-term relationship success and more than people think it does for long-term relationship success. And so I think, without going into all the details, it feels like the connection is there's a lot of wisdom that can be shared from either people in great relationships or people who have lived a good life, or people like Arthur Brooks that are kind of dedicating their academic journalistic world to helping people find happiness and meaning, and basically saying, you're going to be led astray by things like the hedonic treadmill. You're going to be led astray by comparing yourself to somebody else or focusing on the bank account versus the community. But here's what really matters. And so I feel like what's in common with the work that we all do is understanding the natural tendency to focus on the superficial, less important, and using nudges to slowly guide people towards, like, trust me, like, if you follow this path, like, at the end of your life, you will look back and feel proud of the decisions you made. And sort of, how do you subtly guide people towards those enriching, more meaningful lived experiences?
Yeah. I'll bring up one other, I've got a couple, but areas where I see this patterning of wisdom gained in relationship and wisdom gained around end of life. And one of them is to stop trying to fix things.
Mm-hmm.
And when somebody is facing an end of life diagnosis, when they are nearing the end, or just, one of the big lessons is to not constantly try to fix, and that part of us that wants to alter and change and make perfect, and control and not surrender. And I remember, I think it was from the Gottmans, who I know that you worked with as well, after spending, going through a training with the Gottmans. One of my takeaways was, I get to have, these, what did they call them? Stress
reducing conversations.
Stress reducing conversations,
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to being focused on listening to fix someone. So I'd love for you to, because I think the lesson is the same, but it's, maybe articulated even better in the relationship space.
Yeah, I mean, the Gottmans have done such incredible work, and one of my favorite areas that they've explored is conflict. And so one thing that I've seen in dating coaching clients is that they say, my parents never fought, and then they had one fight and they got divorced. So the story in my head is that if you fight, you get divorced. Or my parents fought all the time and they had a horrible relationship, and therefore fighting is bad. And so people have a lot of misconceptions around conflict. And what the Gottmans say is that conflicts are inevitable, and they have this stat: 69% of all relationship conflict is perpetual. And these are unsolvable problems. And so, Michael, if you like to arrive to the airport 5 minutes before your flight takes off, and I like to be at the airport 2 hours early, and we're married, we're just not going to get along on that. And I'm not going to make you an early bird, and you're not going to make me a fly by the seat of your pants person. And so instead of trying to solve that problem, how can you actually just say, okay, from now on, we go to the airport differently? And so just accepting the fact that all relationships have conflict. most of these conflicts will not be overcome, and that it's much more just about navigating conflicts and finding a way to live with another person, which, to be honest, can be very challenging, versus trying to fix the person or find a solution. I think that's very empowering for people, because a common mistake I see people make is they say, well, we have all these problems, so I'm going to trade for a different relationship. But they don't realize, well, every relationship has problems, and you kind of have to just choose a set of problems that you can cope with. Specifically, what you were talking about is that, and I don't mean to use overly gendered terms here, but this is how John Gottman talks about it, is that a lot of times the wife talks to their husband and says, this thing happened at work today and I feel really stressed out. And the husband jumps into problem solving mode. Well, did you bring up this? And did you negotiate that? And did you mention that last month this happened? And they're just trying to solve. And that what actually is happening in that situation is that the wife just wants to vent and she just wants to be heard. And so a great way to communicate what you need is to say, I had a really stressful day at work. I'd love to have an SRC, a stress reducing conversation. And you are signaling to the other person that what you're looking for is validation and support and not problem solving. And maybe at the end you can say, okay, vent over. Can we actually talk about what to do? But I think it's just such a clever little trick, because it's a way for you to identify what you need and to express it to someone in a way that doesn't feel aggressive. It doesn't feel like you're saying, I know you always try to fix me, but I just want you to just say, let's have an SRC. And the person agrees, great. I'm going to put my venting hat on and I'm just going to listen and affirm you. And if later you want a solution, I will help you do that.
Yeah, this is something that we need to teach all people around end of life, to give someone the access of, because a lot of people are having need to vent about a lot of things that are happening with them if they're in terminal treatment or any of the elements of the space that we did you know about this, Deanna, the stress reducing conversation?
No, but as she was talking, and as you all were both talking, y'all need to go to doula school. This is doula school now. This is how
sounds great.
This is how doulas, we're trained as doula. This is how what we talk about exactly. Being a doula has made me a better person. When I'm listening to you talk, it's like the hardest relationship stuff I've ever been through is my family and a lover, a partner. Mm-hmm. My friends, I feel like we have it down. We can acknowledge each other. We can say you hurt my feelings. Like in my world, I have no problem with colleagues or friends. It's partner and family. It's so hard. And I'm asking myself, well, why? And it's because it's so hard to keep my mouth shut and not try to fix, not try to give advice, not try to, you should do this, what, that, and the other. And the doula skills that we learn is just that, is to be quiet, to like all of this stuff to bring presence so that I don't ruin the relationship with my feedback, but to really be a true supportive person in someone's life. And so learning that to be with people who are dying is helping me to do that in my own life. It's the only training ground I've really had where I'm actually practicing it all the time.
I mean, I think you're describing some really interesting dynamics. One thing that I've found in the research is that I feel like we have a lot of misconceptions around what people want from us. And so we're constantly trying to show off, look how interesting I am, look how much I know, look at this story, and oh, people will like me if I perform in this way. But what the research shows is that if you really want to be successful at dating, it's more about being interested than being interesting. And they have this really interesting research where, two people are talking and one person is sort of part of the experiment. And the less that person talks, the more the other person likes them, and not just likes them, but thinks that they're fascinating. And that's because that person gave them a chance to think and explore and all of this. And so people go on dates and they're like, well, I definitely have to mention this trip I went on and this fancy promotion. But it's like, if you actually just shut up and listen to their person and ask them thought-provoking questions, that's how they would like you more. And so I feel like whether it's trying to problem solve instead of stress reduce, or trying to be interesting versus interested, we miscalculate what other people are looking for us. And it's like, most people know what they're going to do and they don't need our advice. They just want this space to explore it for themselves. And I think that's really what the heart of therapy and coaching is anyway. And the average person just thinks, well, my value comes from my brain. And it's like, no, your value comes from bearing witness to the other person's experience.
Exactly. Say that again, sister. Say that again. From bearing witness. I love that.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly what you teach, Deanna.
Well, I like to hear it affirmed in every area under the sun. So here's the behavioral scientist.
No,
Say that again, please. It's awesome.
Yeah.
And you teach people to be curious, to be self-aware as well.
Come with curiosity. Witnessing is more important. Even people who are suicide ideation say that the thing that brought them back, the biggest thing that brought them back, I have heard them say, is somebody witnessing them rather than telling them why they should stay, but witnessing and being with them during. Do you find that, Logan? Is the research?
Yeah, I was just thinking about one other thing you said. I'm trying to remember where my train of thought just went. What we were talking about
bearing witness and curiosity.
Yeah, bearing witness and all these mistakes that people make. Yeah, I guess I'm also just reflecting on my own experience, which is like people who, yeah, anyway, I had lots of thoughts going on about my own experience. But yeah, I think there is a lot that can be taught about your value in life is not being productive, being efficient, solving the problem. Like your value is to just be there with that person for whatever they need. And so I think whether it's giving people relationship advice, showing up on a date, being with people in end of life, I imagine it's not about like serving a purpose beyond just physically being there for them.
And I mean, in my work, a lot of it is just asking questions, and the better questions you ask, the more opportunity for someone to really show themselves and their humanity, and that's when people are at their most beautiful.
Oh yeah. I remembered my train of thought, which is that you said getting curious, and I feel like that's advice that I give all the time. And I have this couple that I work with together, and then I work with them separately. And like the most common thing I say when they have any sort of conflict is get curious. You know, you're moving in together and she wants to keep every single object she's had since childhood. Get curious. Oh, turns out that her mother was in a fire and lost everything. And so she was raised in a family where you have to keep all your objects because they might get lost at any moment. Now you just deepen your relationship. And so I think in general, we jump to assumptions around why people act the way they act, what it means. If I'm a minimalist and I value minimalism, then your hoarding is a problem. But wait, maybe actually there's a deep life story there. And so I think for every element of life, getting curious is good advice.
Yeah. Well, you can't be reactive when you're curious. You can't hold that reactivity with that space. It's like you can't feel love when you're afraid, and that like fear and love kind of counterbalance each other. This notion, and it's actually to bring it back a little bit to Gabor Mate, who Deanna mentioned, who's one of my principal mentors and somebody who you.
I love him. Oh my gosh.
He's a huge part of played a huge part of my life. But what he taught me at some point, which is I think teaching that has gone around in different people's mouths over time, but it's this notion that the space between an event, a thing that happens, a reaction. That space for most of us, you can't put a piece of paper between that space between something happens and I react, but that's the work, right? And that's it's the work in relationships, the work in life, it's the work at end of life is creating some spaciousness around the reaction, and that's a space of curiosity. And he liked to say that's where God exists, and he's like, even though I don't believe in God.
I mean, Viktor Frankl has the same idea, in Man's Search for Meaning. Yeah,
exactly.
Well, yeah, what you're saying, what I'm seeing, the value of practicing dualist skills has made me a better person. I could see practicing relationship skills purely from a place of romantic love, whether you're married or not married with someone 50 years or a year. Practicing that, taking that in with curiosity will make us a better person, even to our friends. To not just look at the work you do as just with romantic partners,
Yeah.
even though that might be what you're studying here. I study death, I study dying, but that particular specific work has really expanded my life. And I see the same with your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I happen to be super interested in romantic relationships, and I love debunking myths around marriage and happily ever after fallacy and all of that. But the core of it is not romantic relationships, it's relationships. And in fact, I feel like one of the most important roles I play in my life is just being a friend and, being a
Yes.
really good friend. And so I think this is the beginning of my research, but we'll see kind of where it winds up, especially considering what's going on in my personal life. I imagine both for myself and for my husband, who happens to be an AI cancer researcher, this is going to lead us in many interesting directions.
What's AI cancer researcher?
So he works at Google and he works on machine learning algorithms in the medical space. And so if you're familiar with mammograms, basically one radiologist or two radiologists will review your mammograms and tell you, if you need to come in for more testing or if you need a biopsy or things like that. And so he's developed a system along with his team that can actually read mammograms and give readings that are more accurate than a radiologist about whether or not the person seems to have cancer and what needs to happen next. And they actually just started their first clinical trial last week. And so the idea is not to get rid of radiologists, but to actually become a tool that helps radiologists become more accurate, sort of like you wouldn't write an email without spell check. In the future, hopefully radiologists wouldn't read a mammogram without using this assisted radiology screening tool.
Oh, yeah. We have a question from somebody who's listening, our friend Adrian, who works with the elderly and provides care and assistance for people as they, are quite a bit older. But she's curious about how Hinge and probably other apps, how they've accommodated people at different ages, especially the elderly, and she's curious if there are safety measures that are built in. And I know that there are a lot of older people of different ages on the different apps, Hinge, etc. But I'm curious if do you try to create a slightly different environment? Are there any considerations that go into thinking about people at different phases of their life?
Yeah, so in the work that I've done, I've worked one-on-one matchmaking, dating coaching with people in their 20s and 30s, a few people in their 40s. And that's really where my knowledge comes from and where what the book is written about. And so essentially helping people who are millennials find their first relationship and make a great decision about partner selection, perhaps with children and marriage in mind. However, since my book came out 5 weeks ago, I've gotten an overwhelming amount of emails from people who are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, either saying, I read your book and I found these to be universal truths and really helpful, or I read your book, but where do I go to meet someone? And so I actually feel like humbly, I'm just not an expert at dating at those stages, but seems to be a huge opportunity there, because whether it's working with people who are divorced, who never got married, widows and widowers, people never stop wanting to find a partner and wanting to find love. And I have a Facebook group that I run for people who are reading my book and having questions. And even just this week, somebody posted and was like, I'm a single dad who all my friends are married. I feel very isolated. What's the best dating app for me? What's the community for me? Or somebody in their 70s said, what's the best dating app for somebody over 70? And so I don't have kind of the perfect researched answer right now. And technically all the dating apps allow you to be any age. There's no age cutoff, but I do feel like there's an opportunity for more research and more support for people later in life who are looking for love and don't want to feel marginalized in that search.
Yeah. And I remember working with my sister who's in her mid 70s on her Bumble dating profile, and also just seeing that there was plenty of action to be had in the age that she was looking around for. So and she was shy and nervous and excited, and it was literally like she seemed like she was 20.
I know, and I think, right, we expect that people grow out of it, or that other things become important to you. But finding partnership, finding companionship, whether you're having sex or not, whether you're living together or not, I think that this is like a very natural human need to want to, right? It's bearing witness to my life. It's being there when I wake up. It's the person I talk to when my family's driving me crazy. Like, I think at any age, that person is very important.
It ain't over till it's over. That's for sure. I mean, I remember when I was younger, it was like if you weren't good looking, ooh, what, you're having sex? And the older I get and my youthfulness is gone, it's like, yeah, you do. And it's good and it's fun. And yes, we do still look for love, no matter how old we are. Everybody, I have many people, friends who are older than me, much older. I'm going to be 60 this year. And I have friends much older than me, and they are having a ball in many ways, and in the spark and the vibrance and the desire and the witnessing communication, all of it. They're just more interested, realizing we don't have stage fright anymore. So we're really there. We're really present.
No more stage fright. Yeah. And you grow into your body and you grow into yourself. And some of the small things, like maybe religion, becomes less important when you're not raising kids together. I think, it's sort of, some of the noise moves away and you can really focus on what matters.
So we have a relationship expert with us, and we probably have some people that are single that are listening now, and will be listening when we send this out more widely. You gave some advice throughout, talking about acknowledging how you feel when you're with somebody, like how you felt with your husband. I think that's one of your principal pieces, as opposed to your list of things that you think you need. Maybe spend the next 15 minutes or so, 10 or 15 minutes, just giving people those best bits of advice they can walk away with.
Sure. Yeah, my pleasure. So the beginning of the book, Getting Ready, is all about self-awareness. And one of the key ideas is that we have these dating blind spots, these patterns of thinking, patterns of behavior that are holding us back from finding love that we can't identify on their own. And I have worked with people from a lot of different walks of life, and it seems like they still all suffer from the same 3 main dating blind spots. And so I've categorized them into this framework called the dating tendencies. And each one suffers from unrealistic expectations. And so the first one is the romanticizer. And it would be fun afterwards to kind of apply this 3 dating tendencies to death, because this is my sort of original framework and something I think about all the time, more so than attachment theory. And so the romanticizer, they love. They believe in the soulmate, the one person out there for them. And so how this affects them is that they don't want to put effort into finding someone. They feel like they can go to the farmer's market and reach for the perfect tomato, and Prince Charming will reach for the tomato at the same time. And Michael was talking about the meet cute, but they're very focused on the meet cute. And the biggest problem with the romanticizer is that they think, if it's my soulmate, then it'll be effortless. And if it feels hard, then it must be the wrong person. And so they give up on great partners because they aren't willing to put in the work, and they just move on to the next person, hoping then it will be perfect. The second type is the maximizer. And this type of person is very focused on doing their research, turning over every stone. I only want to make a decision when I've seen the complete set. And so they're always asking questions like, could I be 5% happier with somebody else? She's ambitious, but could she be more ambitious? And it's about optimizing and the perfect choice. And really, there's this key miscalculation here, which is life is not about making the right decision. It's about how you feel about your decision. And so the alternative to the maximizer is what's known as the Satisficer. And this is the person, they can have very high standards, but they set a standard. And when they meet that standard, they're happy with it. And so the example I give in the book is somebody who's buying an espresso machine and they go to the New York Times review site Wirecutter and they read 100 reviews and they say the Breville 621 is the best espresso machine of all time, and they buy it, and then when they're drinking their coffee they say, you know, it is a tiny bit bitter. I should have gotten this other one, and they're stewing about what they could have bought. Versus the Satisficer says Nespresso is a good brand. I'll go to the mall, I'll buy an espresso machine, look at these fun little colored pods, and then they're just happy with it. And so the Satisficer, they don't have the best espresso machine of all time according to Wirecutter, but they're happy with their decision. And so it's much more about how you feel about your decisions than making the quote unquote objective right decision. And then the last one is the Hesitator. And these are people who have unrealistic expectations of themselves. And so they're very focused on, I'll be ready to date when I lose 10 pounds, when I get promoted, when I clean up my apartment. And they don't feel like they're lovable yet. They feel like love is this conditional thing that they have to earn. And they feel like one day they'll wake up and be 100% ready to date. But this is really a misconception, because you're never 100% ready for something. And people out there who are as imperfect as you are going on dates, getting better at dating, figuring out the kind of person they want to be with. And that if you just hesitate, and even if it's things like focusing on self-growth or going to therapy, you also have to be dating, because dating is a skill and it requires practice. And you don't just wake up one day and say, I'm ready to date, and then meet your soulmate. You actually have to take time to get to know yourself and learn how to date. And so since the book's come out, it's been interesting to have people self-identify as, I'm a maximizer, I'm always looking what else is out there, or I'm a romanticizer, I don't do the dating apps because they're not romantic enough, or I'm a hesitator, I'm waiting to date until the pandemic's over. But you know, it might be interesting to hear how these types relate to end of life, because for example, I could imagine you know, the maximizer might be focused on things like, I need to set up every single account in a certain way, and they're not really focusing on the bigger picture. Or the romanticizer wants to have a certain type of death at home, but that's just not possible. And anyway, I'm curious if that sparked anything for you in your fields.
Definitely.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the doer. In my words, it's the doer. And also the other is like a sacred, like almost an expectation that you must consider it sacred. There's a whole group of people that, you know, it almost requires you to look at it as sacred, when actually it's quite terrifying for many people. And so they set a high expectation that if you're not looking at it in a more sacred way, you're not as evolved. I don't know what that would be. Would that be the maximizer?
I don't know. Maybe that's kind of the romanticizer. They have a romantic view of death that kind of prevents them from thinking about the practicalities or something.
Some of the practicalities.
Yeah.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was doing that very thing of like, okay, that would be the doer. That would be yeah.
Well, and one thing that's definitely a through line and unexpected is this idea of practicing dating. Like hearing you talk about that was a light bulb went off in my head around just dating in general and how you see it as a skill that people have. And we talk about practicing dying.
I love that.
And we talk about because the thing is, our work is not in any way just about people who are at the end of their life or have any kind of diagnosis or are grieving. It's really for all people to realize that having a relationship with their mortality, you know, gives them certain gifts. At different times of your life, it'll give you certain gifts. And practicing dying, I mean, some people do take this quite seriously, like when they have a terrible flu, say like, well, this is hard, but it's actually going to prepare me more for when I'm at, you know, when it is my final chapter, et cetera, because it's about surrender. And learning how to surrender is really important, and to accept and to allow.
That's why we should all be doing more ayahuasca.
Yeah.
It's called the the death vine for a reason, and my ayahuasca work was actually done with Gabor Mate to bring it all back together. So,
Wow.
and
You
you
have some talking to do, Michael. Yeah.
that surrendering is so important when something is larger than yourself. But still, go ahead, Deanna.
No, I was just saying when I'm listening to Logan and you're so young and I can just see you're so full of life and you're so smart and all these things. And I'm thinking a game, I don't know what gamification is. I'm showing my ignorance, but I understand it's about game, like bringing things into the gaming realm. And when you talked about connecting, or that study that connected people to their future self and that it made them behave a different way, I could see bringing that to end of life, Michael. So just, if I looked at myself at 85-year-old Deanna, and then what would I do the rest of my life? It would be different than me thinking of 60-year-old Deanna, what am I going to do at 85? I don't relate to 85. When she said that, I totally went there. And it's only 25 years away from me, so much less if you're 30, right?
Yeah, I definitely think that you could do it. And just, I mean, I don't know exactly what the goal is like with your app and your technology in the community, but if the goal is to help people practice dying, I think.
Or to visualize.
Yeah, it's about visualization. Yeah.
Life. Yeah.
And making your future self feel more connected to your present self.
I think that would change the trajectory of your next 50 years. If I'm 30 and I do this exercise where I'm looking at my future self at 85 and I relate to it and I connect to it, it might change what I actually do
100%
on the pathway to it.
The other research that is relevant, are you familiar with Dan Gilbert? He's a psychology professor at Harvard.
I've heard the name, but I don't know.
He wrote this wonderful book called Stumbling on Happiness that I read when I was a teen or in my early 20s, and my husband actually just reread it last week. It's been a very influential book in our lives, and it's all about how we're bad at forecasting what will make us happy. And so we think that becoming a lottery winner will make us very happy, but a year after winning the lottery, we revert to our same level of happiness. We think becoming a quadriplegic will ruin our life. A year later, we go back to the same level of happiness. And so just all these miscalculations we make around happiness. And when everything happened with my husband's diagnosis, I actually emailed Dan Gilbert and told him what was going on and just how important his work was to me. And he wrote back this lovely email just saying, like, as crazy as it seems, like, you're going to look back and see your husband's amputation as one of the best things that ever happened to you. Like, it is going to affect the course of your life in so many positive ways in terms of, my husband's become less rigid. We've become more empathetic. We're more caring. We're more connected to our community. And just having this expert in the field be like, this is going to be one of the best things that ever happened to you in the middle of it was so helpful. But the reason why I brought him up is he has this really cool research. He and this woman, Jane Ebert, have this research called the end of history illusion. And it's this idea that we always think we're done changing. So you say to somebody who's 50, how much did you change from 40 to 50? Oh, so much. How much will you change from 50 to 60? Nothing. I'm already who I'm going to become. But it's very true. At every decade, it's consistent. And so we always think we're done changing, but we're never done changing. And that's why it's the end of history illusion, because we are constantly evolving. And so I think just different ways of reminding people that each decade and every year is a chance to really change, I think can be very empowering, because then you can actually make different choices and you're not enslaved to, your previous decisions.
I spent about a half of a chapter in my last book, looking at the work of Daniel Kahneman and the biases, and then starting to apply them.
Cool. So look, you're the behavioral scientist doing the application.
No, I mean,
he's awesome.
The Reader's Digest version of it. But what I realized was, like, there could be not just a singular book, but many books just looking on our hidden biases and how it relates to why we don't talk about end of life, why we don't have a plan. I mean, I think hopefully we take a step back from COVID, and it's driving people towards making better decisions, maybe, or more aware decisions about love and what they really want. And I think that for many of us who work in the space, we hope that it inspires a kind of golden age of people planning. Because we've seen that millennials are actually going to the end of life planning sites at a higher frequency than any other.
Is it on behalf of their parents though? Because I could see myself doing that.
No, I think it's a combination of both. It's just like, wait a second, I'm feeling anxious about this. I want to at least know something about having an end.
Oh, that makes sense. Well, I mean, even just the guy from Zappos, Tony Hsieh, who died, and they're saying he didn't have a will, he didn't have any end of life plan, and now there's all these lawsuits. It's like that person was a genius. That person had a lot of money and a lot of assets to take care of. Like, how does someone like that not have an end of life? And I know end of life means a lot more than financial, but it is these moments where you're just like, very smart people are making very poor choices around this.
Yeah, and Tony was a friend.
Okay, sorry if I was being insensitive, but I was very surprised.
It's not. It is ridiculous how, avoidant we are of this. That's why, we don't have the carrot in the same way that you work in love,
right,
romance, and we don't have the carrot, I think, because it hasn't been defined. And and that's why I end up being pretty repetitive with this idea that facing your mortality actually is the greatest source of knowing why you're here, your meaning, your wisdom, because we need to really identify that there is a value. There's not just the stick. But I see COVID as the potential of being like an earthquake in California.
Yeah. I mean, what came to mind for me when you were saying that is like, yes, I think, right, people are motivated by love and fear. And so they're motivated to seek love, but they also have fear of dying alone, which obviously my title is very provocative, but it's playing into this idea of loss aversion and this fear and getting people to change their behavior. But I think money is similar to death in that people are afraid of it, people are avoidant about it, and that even when people have information, they don't always want to see it. And so I had a friend who worked at Intuit, and she would do these studies where she'd bring people in to go through their budgets and their money. And when she would pull it up on a computer, people would literally shield their eyes. They didn't want to know, and they didn't want to face the realities of their money. And there's this story that I've heard about where back in the day with HIV testing, people would go in and they'd have to return several days later for their results. And a lot of people just wouldn't show up. And it was this idea that like, they knew they were at risk, they knew they needed to be tested, but they just didn't want the information. And so I think around things like money, there's a lot to be learned for how do we face things that are hard for us. And I think what the behavioral science approach has been is you're never going to get people to want to face it. So you build systems that help them face it. And so people aren't going to do a good job at saving for retirement. So default them into a 401k. And from the small amount that I know about your research, it feels like you're doing exactly that. You're basically creating the environment and the system to reduce the friction of thinking about it. Because as much as it would be great if we all had that app that 5 times a day reminds you that you're going to die, right? Most people aren't going to do that. What people are going to do is make a couple good decisions once, I think, and then hopefully be set up for later. That would be what I would expect.
Yeah, we have to Trojan horse these things. We have to say, come, hear from Logan Ury. She's going to help you find love. Now we're actually going to talk about that.
True. It's really about the dying alone part. Yeah.
Well, what I see in all of it, it's about the connecting to wanting connection from other human beings requires us to connect to our own heart first. And when you put that how to not die alone, it really, it is provocative, but it's the truth. So many people say, God, I don't want to die alone. They don't mean die actually taking their last breath alone. Yeah. They want to be in companionship and love.
Yeah.
And it's about connection. And if we could connect the finite of death to that which would bring our hearts so much joy, I think, Michael, right? That's what we're trying to do out here in this end of life space of many of us. It's not just educating about how to behave at the end of life or get resources or be an advocate. It's about loving your life because we only have so much of it. When so many of us think it's always going to be there. It's always, our death is out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's my favorite Confucius line is, in each life, there are 2 lives. And the second one doesn't begin until we realize that there is only one.
I love that. Have you seen the work? Do you know who Tim Urban is? He has this Wait But Why blog. Do you know Tim?
We've not personally, but yeah.
Okay, I just feel like of all the people who have kind of helped create like my style frame around it, he's done some really cool stuff. He has, maybe you're familiar with this, but he has this calendar you can print that's basically like, this is your life, and like every square represents, you know, this many years. And so it really helps you think like, wow, I'm a third through of the way through my life. Do I like where it is? And it creates a visual for like how far along you are. Or he has this thing that's like, if this is the amount of time that you'll spend with your parents, you've done like 90% of it by the time you're 18 and leave the house. And it really helps you focus on like, what are the realities of my life, of my parents dying, of all these things? And just by visualizing it in a way where it's like squares checked off, I think that really helps people see like, this is a finite resource. This is not something that like just goes on and on and on for however long I want.
Yeah. No, that's a great, I will look into it. And
I know, I love the sound of that.
Yeah, well, and it's going against like where we started at the beginning of this conversation. We are irrational. We have these blind spots. We do think that we're going to live forever. We can't imagine our own death because we can't remember a death. And so, you know, we're working against it in just the same way that you know, have kind of spelled it out for people. We're moving towards this kind of taxonomy, this kind of clarity for people. So it's inspiring to see what you've done. And it's such a gift. Thank you for being here. I think we're
Thank you.
Such a great way to spend 90 minutes. And, you know, I'm going to probably spend the night learning more about doula school and all of the interesting people that you brought up. And yeah, I mean, it's really fun to have a conversation and to connect the dots of my work in a new way. And, you know, I really appreciate you for creating the space to do that.
Yeah, I'm so looking forward to learning more about you, Logan. Thank you so much for sharing your life with us.
And the next time, so I'm going to send you some stuff on terror management theory. And then,
okay.
Send it to me too. I want to.
Yeah, and then we're going to have a conversation about behavioralism, terror management theory.
Great. Until next time.
Yeah. Great.
Can't wait.
All right. Thanks to everybody out there
Thank
for the
you.
questions we didn't answer. We'll get to them, I hope.
Have a good night. Bye.
Good night. Good night. Good night, Mike.
Take it away.
Bye-bye, y'all.